Welcome to our final session of the program. I want to introduce Azza El-Masri. So she is a doctoral student at the University of Texas at Austin. She studies and has trained journalists all over the world in journalism, disinformation, and digital security. Her focus has particularly been on Northern Africa and the Middle East. And her presentation today is not just going to do a basic overview of misinformation and disinformation, but also get into really specific amplification of political messages, especially on social media and various things. So let's welcome Azza, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Like Anne said, I used to work in North Africa and the Middle East. I did a lot of research, and I worked with Midan, which is a non-profit media tech company. And I worked with, and I trained journalism students, human rights organizations, and independent media workers specifically over the last 3-4 years on fact-checking and open source investigations. And basically this presentation will be a culmination of what I found in terms of the ecosystem that allows misinformation to spread and to sort of amplify, right? We all play a role in misinformation, whether we know it or not. And it's basically, I want us to take a little bit of a step back rather than go into the definitional differences between misinformation and disinformation, which I'll give a refresher, of course, but not in the nitty-gritty in terms of the different contexts. First of all, we know that since 2016, researchers, media organizations, even donors have been obsessed with misinformation. And the focus mainly was on individual behavior and how it impacted individual behavior, and not really about the sociopolitical and economic context that allow for misinformation to, or disinformation, or even propaganda to, spread. But what's true and what's been talked about all the time is that partisanship and low trust in media are major culprits in the exposure of misinformation. I would deconstruct that a little bit because I feel like that's a bit of a simplistic view of how misinformation is amplified or propaganda is amplified, both in the Middle East where I'm from, but also in your context in the US and elsewhere. As a refresher, misinformation, as you know, is sort of false content, but the person sharing it doesn't know. So they're not aware, they don't have an intention to harm others. It's driven by socio-psychological factors. People perform their identities online, and so because they want to feel like they're part of their tribe, they want to share stuff that are like their tribe. So it leads to the sort of increase in misinformation. Disinformation, on the other hand, has a clear intent to harm, and it's motivated by 3 factors: to make money, to have political influence, either foreign or domestic, or to cause trouble for the sake of it. But what ecosystem sustains these varied forms of misleading content? And that's exactly what I'm going to go into today. Before that, core assumptions, why people use the internet or why people seek out information. 1, we know that individuals will consume news to keep track of their political officials and of world events, and they would seek out information that affirms their worldview, which would imbue their beliefs with credibility. We know that elites profit from and ascertain control over identity-confirming discourse. And I think a lot of the components that I would be talking about, even the media to a certain extent, as a journalist who has worked in Lebanon and elsewhere, but even we see when we talk about the political economic pressures of the media in the US as well, we see that elites exert power over identity-confirming discourse. We can think about it in terms of the advertising pressure that a lot of you or a lot of the publishers that you work for have gone through, and how that affects the way that you work. And media outlets and journalists run the risk of punishment if they deviate from the discourse. There's a controversial thing here where I would be talking about objectivity here. The role of objectivity, or, it's something that in my J school, we talk about it, and I've been, a Washington Post veteran taught me since I was in undergrad that objectivity, this both sideism. But we know that if we deviate from this discourse of objectivity of the both sides, we would risk, we would risk punishment in terms of not getting the beats that we're supposed to get, not getting not getting ahead or going up levels in our organization. But I wanted to give you a high-level, view of how misinformation spreads by taking into consideration not just the media, the politicians, or the public, but also putting into contrast foreign interests, social media, and partisan groups, because these are things, or these are organizations or components that we talk about separately, but actually they work together in this ecosystem that allows for the amplification of propaganda and misinformation. So I'll deconstruct it because it looks a bit complicated, and I'll start first with looking at the relationship between the media, politicians, and the public. This whole thing, or this whole propaganda loop, as I like to call it, networked propaganda loop, was the result of research and conversations I've had with journalists and journalism students, publishers, digital security experts, and also because of my experience as a journalist in North Africa and Western Asia. But I feel like it's also applicable to a lot of other places, including the US in different certain circumstances. And I know each of you have different focuses and beats. Some of you focus on your state or your county or your city. Some of you focus more on a federal level, looking at the US in general, certain topics, and some of you may have focused on international topics. But at the end of the day, we're looking more at the political economic pressures and the political economic dynamics that allow for misinformation to spread. So we're thinking about power dynamics, we're thinking about the implicit relationships between each of these components. So we know, for example, the media deliver favorable coverage of identity-confirming politicians, although it's not necessarily explicit. They also attack opponents. Again, it's not explicit. And they police deviance from identity confirmation through implicit editorial decisions that go into editing, copy editing, and then what gets published at the end. On the other hand, their relationship with the public is that they deliver identity-conforming news and opinion as a bundle. So, for example, someone who reads the New York Times or someone who reads the Associated Press does not read Fox News or does not read ONA, I guess. I don't know much about American politics so far. But that's my case. I read the New York Times, I read the Associated Press, but I do not click on Fox News. And that's because I seek information or news that confirms my identity and confirms my beliefs. In contexts like North Africa and Western Asia, the relationship also is not one of trust between the public and the media, but one of dependency. Because we depend on we only have these media. We don't have alternatives. There isn't plurality in the media. But in a lot of places, even where plurality is guaranteed, the segmentation of the population creates sort of a relationship of dependency in identity-confirming media, because we are no longer interested in diversifying our views or diversifying our beliefs or being challenged for our beliefs. And then looking at politicians and their relationship both to the media and partisan groups. And partisan groups are usually left out of the equation when we think about misinformation, or they're taken as a lone sort of rogue group. So thinking about QAnon and their huge possibly huge influence, but we're not really putting the dots together about how the media might benefit from this, but as well how politicians benefit from this, and they work together. So we know that politicians, to a certain extent, exert editorial and economic control to ascertain identity-affirming, confirming coverage. So this includes with in the US, for example, there's a revolving door between the lobbies and Congress and sort of seats of power in public office. And lobbies exert economic power as well as political power on different aspects of life in the US, including, in certain areas, journalistic work. So certain lobbies like AT&T, Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc., that are big advertising companies, at the end of the day, they affect the way that we work. Maybe not explicitly, but they do that implicitly in terms of like the way that you have to change your advertising on Facebook in order to work towards their community standards. And because there's a revolving door between lobbies and politicians, we see that there is an implicit sort of power and control that this would lead in terms of the media, at least from the US perspective. From a NAWA perspective or a North Africa, Western Asia perspective, it's more direct. It's in laws, but also in the fact that they actually own the media companies. In terms of the relationship between politicians and partisan groups, it's the same across any country, all countries. We know this just by looking at when Donald Trump had his Twitter account and how he used to incentivize his loyal base to amplify support for his narratives. And this would lead to actual implications offline as well as online. With a focus on partisan groups here, we see this relationship between politicians and partisan groups, but then I also add the role that social media play, not in terms of the platform itself, but the content moderation policies and how the content moderation policies and the lack of content moderation of exaggerated and amplified propaganda gets picked up by certain media organizations as though it's authentic. And we call this behavior #laundering. #laundering is basically framing amplified propaganda online as if it's authentic and giving it credence in the wider political discourse through media organizations that pick it up and say this is public opinion. So there's two things here to focus on. One, social media organizations or social media platforms don't necessarily, or they profit off of this amplification and they profit off of this inauthentic behavior. And a lot of times, because of the constraints and the pressures that we have as journalists, having to deal with a highly, stressful environment where we need to get publishing quickly and stuff like that, we end up sometimes covering coordinated behavior as authentic. And then, most importantly, I think, is looking at foreign interests. Foreign interests might not be something that we think about advertently or directly in the US, but in a lot of different contexts, it's really important. And I do think, to a certain extent, the conversations around Ukraine and Russia in the last 4 years, or in the last 4 years in the United States, warrants some thinking about foreign interests and what foreign interests play in local politics or in federal politics or in the United States, and vice versa. So we know, in our case in the Middle East, foreign interests exert power over politicians, and they exert power in terms of legislation, in terms of political control and political power, but also foreign interests fund information operations on social media to sway public opinion. So thinking about Cambridge Analytica, for example, the whole scandal around Cambridge Analytica is an information operation. Thinking about the routine takedowns of Twitter accounts and Twitter posts, as well as Facebook accounts, troll and bots and human accounts that lead to or contribute to sort of inauthentic behavior are information operations. And again, we have the cyclical nature between social media and the mainstream media. So yeah, hashtag laundering, I'm giving 2 examples here from Egypt, where hashtag laundering is the media coverage of information operations with the aim of increasing engagement on social media and giving the cover of legitimacy and credibility. We saw this happen in Egypt routinely. We see this happening across a lot of Arab-speaking countries, including Lebanon and Syria and Yemen, which are my focus. I focus on these 3 countries. And I guarantee you, with the rise of the interest in social media news or social media viral stories, there may have been some of these hashtag laundering stories that have slipped off in certain American media. But at the end of the day, what this means is that disinformation and misinformation is an access to information issue. It's not just a information issue, it's an access to information issue, because this is relevant in our understanding of corruption. It's also relevant in our understanding of the system, the political system that we are working through as journalists and as individuals who are interested in the truth and who seek the truth. So thinking about misinformation and disinformation shouldn't be necessarily about how this impacts people, just how this impacts people, but how this is an affront to our work as journalists because of our inability to verify or to get to the truth. It stops us from doing our actual real work. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Could we start just by going back to hashtag laundering? Could you explain that a bit more?
Yes. I can explain that more. So hashtag laundering is when information operations have to do, so troll farms, or could be individuals or bots, we don't know, start a hashtag that becomes more and more about a certain political topic that is important, that becomes more and more and more relevant. Or it's done so inauthentically, so it becomes trending on the Twitter trending top 10, and media organizations that are linked to the foreign interests that have paid for these information operations pick it up and portray them as this is reflective of public opinion. So this is basically what hashtag laundering is. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions for Azza?
I was wondering if you could talk about like what you can do once something is trending, once there is a hashtag trending, and once the misinformation is out there. Like, what are the tools to combat that?
Yeah. So in terms of thinking about information operations, you want to take a closer look at the actual accounts, because when you take a look at a hashtag in its entirety, you will find some things that are probably authentic, but most of the time you'll find overlapping tweets, accounts that retweet each other, accounts with sort of weird usernames, usually a string of numbers and letters, accounts that have been just created for the very purpose of posting the exact same text over and over again. So these are the sort of telltale hints that you would have to look at in terms of information operations. Of course, there is like a bit more sophisticated softwares that you could use, but this is the beginning, yeah.
So one of the things that I asked the lecturer that we had who was talking about objectivity, and I was curious to pose it to you as well, is, there's a little bit of a difference between a politician or a candidate lying every once in a while, right, to push a message, versus one who is constantly spewing out mis or disinformation. And I was wondering, in your kind of experiences in Africa and elsewhere, what you would kind of suggest for somebody like me who is covering this, but
has to figure out a way to not just constantly be using my platform to dispel what they're saying or correct what they're saying, but also cover them in a way that, they're a serious candidate. Mm-hmm. They are being taken seriously and gaining momentum. So how do you, have you seen any tips that anybody had in finding that balance between making sure that you're not just perpetuating their misinformation or disinformation or constantly dispelling it, but also kind of covering who they are and what they are?
Mm-hmm. So I haven't seen actual explicit examples of this, but this is such a good question because we see this happen not just in the US but across Europe as well as in North Africa and Western Asia. But you ask a question that I talk about with my media law students all the time in terms of ethics. So you want to, at the end of the day, you want to go back to our code of ethics as journalists, which is minimizing harm, but also transparency. So I think at the heart of it is a question of transparency. How transparent are we going to be with our readers? And how are we going to do it without also compromising on our journalistic ability and our journalistic integrity, as well as the sources that we got? So I think it's an interesting balance that you're asking, because at the same time there could be some sort of backfire on you where that person will no longer be a source, right? Will refuse to get quoted from you again. But I feel like when you talk to this person, that's the first thing you need to talk about. You have to tell them, okay, but I'm going to say X, Y, and Z, and what you said is wrong. But I do think that X, Y, or like Z7 or whatever is something interesting that I would like to cover as well. I think it's important to be as transparent as possible and to stand your ground, because at the end of the day, the power lies in your hands and your editor's hands, but over the politician in terms of the information that's being circulated. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Emma with the Boston Globe. This is kind of a similar question, but something I struggled with recently is kind of the line between when you should, as a journalist, correct misinformation or disinformation, and when you should, as a journalist, ignore it. Because, the idea that even like granting attention to a rumor, even if you're correcting it, you've given it more oxygen. So can you talk about like where you put that tipping point?
Because I used to do it all the time, right? I used to be a fact checker. So it was very tiring. It's not only tiring in terms of like how you need to write it down doing the research, but it has a toll on you mentally, and makes you a bit paranoid in your real life, in your personal life. But there's no clear guideline between what to ignore and what to debunk. And I think Tomoa has a better answer for this because she's the director of fact-checking at Univision, so which is what she's going to talk about. But to me, I think it has to do with your priorities as a journalist. If this story is a priority for you, I think it's important to debunk it. But if it's not a priority to your beat or to your to your role in this newspaper or this organization, then it's someone else's role to debunk it. That's basically what I would say. I think fact-checking is important, but it's also we need to be cognizant as well of the mental toll that it has on fact-checkers and on people who consistently debunk misinformation and find pushback from individuals and audiences. I think it's really important to think about that as well.
Blaze Gainey with WPLN in Nashville. And how do you deal with kind of what you were just saying, like when people come back at you about things that you've taken the time to find out are false, but obviously it's like a group of people that believe that it's true?
Yeah. So how do I do that? Like, how do I deal with it personally, or do you mean how do I deal with it publicly?
Publicly.
Publicly, I don't deal with it publicly, because then they would use that against you, right? Especially when we're talking about people who are very overzealous about their beliefs. So thinking about vaccine misinformation or the anti-vax movement, it's very hard to use facts to change people's opinions. It's immensely hard. The research has shown that it's not facts that changes people's opinions, it's emotions. So thinking about that is that maybe we need to think about fact-checking and talking about it from an emotional perspective rather than just a factual perspective. Because emotions is what drives people to believe what they believe. It's not the information itself.
Could you expound on that?
Yeah.
Like the emotional part of it?
Yeah. So certainly. So anger and fear leads to more misinformation sharing or disinformation sharing, whereas anxiety allows you to sort of think about it. Research has shown that emotional effects of misinformation usually has to do with the negative intonation or the negative tones of the news or the information itself. So whatever is increasingly negative and increasingly sort of panic-driven gets shared quickly. So what you want to do is to calm down the person. You want to tell them, I hear you, but did you know X, Y, and Z? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Ricardo Lopez. I'm a reporter in Minnesota. I was curious to get your thoughts on a situation that has happened in Minnesota before. There's been, over the years, kind of targeted and coordinated disinformation attacks towards one of our Congress members, Representative Ilhan Omar. And one of the big ones involved Project Veritas that published some videos that they claimed showed were examples of like ballot harvesting. There was like a local Somali organizer who was accused of basically collecting ballots but then filling them out. And so it included sort of the surreptitiously shot video that made it seem like people were undercover, that kind of thing. And what was really sophisticated about that was that the morning that they published their report, there were already talking points and reaction coming from Republican officials drawing attention to this, right? And so we as news organizations in Minnesota were left trying to verify what the claims that were being made. And in the end, there was one organization, the Sahan Journal, that got an interview with that person who was shown in the video with the ballots. And he ended up recanting and said he had been paid. And it was just like, but by that point, it was already out in sort of the political realm. And that's not the first time that that has happened to her, at least. And so then, we're, as news organizations, we're wrestling with how do we deal with that level of sophisticated coordination, and how do you debunk it in a way that doesn't continue to circulate that.
See, the thing is, it's because a lot of these things that have to do with Representative Ilhan Omar is happening on social media, right? So the onus of responsibility shouldn't necessarily be just on you as journalists, but also on the platforms that have set community standards, but they are not applying them because at the time, at least, when these sort of targeted disinformation operations were happening, and they were being recycled by political officials, Facebook had a newsworthiness sort of clause where they would let politicians spread disinformation because it was newsworthy. So what we're talking about here is that the labor that you're putting should be preemptively sort of taken by social media giants that have the actual capacity and the labor to curtail it. So it's not just your job to do it, and I think also Tamoa has more to say about that. But I think it's important as journalists to open channels of communication with Facebook or Twitter's news partnership teams and to really start these conversations and become stakeholders and trusted partners. It's hard. I've started this project with Facebook and their news partnership project in the MENA region, and it's been very hard, and sometimes they won't listen to you. But it's incredibly powerful to have this open channel because you would let them in on what you see, and then they would act on it. But keep in mind, they act on it 24 to 48 hours after. So whether or not you're doing the labor, it also takes 24 to 48 hours, right? So the damage is done. So what do we do? And the thing is, if for example, Ilhan decides to take it to court, she can't because of the First Amendment and because of the strong protections that the First Amendment provides, not just to journalists, but to individuals' free expression and free speech rights. So it's a whole thorny subject. Yeah.
You were saying that Facebook's policy is to allow them to say it because it's newsworthy?
It was at the time. So they recently walked back this policy to this newsworthiness policy. It started in October 2019, I assume, or October 2018, around the midterm elections in the US, and they just scaled them back around a year ago. Around a year ago.
And then I guess like as a follow-up to that, do you feel as if like debunking and giving, because to debunk, then you have to bring up what happened, like that went wrong. Do you feel like it just almost still helps their cause of trying to spread it?
I think it depends on how you actually write up your fact check. In a lot of places, they tell you that you need to write the fact check. You need to sort of regurgitate, for clickbait purposes, the misinformation in the headline and say fact check. But to me, I think you should say what's wrong with it immediately in the headline so that it doesn't get taken out of context. Because as you all know, most people don't read what they find online. They just see the headline and then they share it. Yeah. So these are all things that we need to think about as journalists, and makes our work so much harder.
Mohammed Ibrahim with the Associated Press in Minnesota. I was curious if you do you have any methods for us as reporters to kind of discern the difference between disinformation and misinformation, and kind of discern whether that intent to harm exists?
Such a good question.
Does that even matter if they have the same effect?
Such a good question, because I was just writing about like how intentionality is so hard to actually discern. It's really, really hard to actually discern, because you have, in a lot of places I used to do, I look at disinformation on encrypted messaging platforms. So I look at it on WhatsApp, I look at it on Telegram, and it's incredibly hard to go to the source of the misleading content. But if you're looking at Facebook or Twitter, even then, you can't even tell the intention. For example, you can tell the intention if it's like political advertising or misleading advertising, because they are making money off of this, right? They are intentionally spreading disinformation to a targeted population. So this is disinformation. As opposed to misinformation, I have been a victim of misinformation. I'm sure you've been a victim of misinformation, and all of us have. And that's when it becomes problematic, when we want to just to like inculpate, anyone of being a disinformation agent. And it also runs the recourse of you being sued. You can be sued for defamation as a journalist in the US if you say someone is a disinformation agent. So these are all things to think about, and intentionality specifically is very hard to construe, very, very hard to construe. But there are certain circumstances when it comes to political advertising, when it comes to sort of where you see the money being spent on it, when it's explicitly shown that there's an intention to harm, which is also very hard to discern, then you can say it's disinformation 100%. Most of the time, that's why most people say misinformation. But that's also but at the same time, what happens is that we deconstruct the spectrum of misinformation and disinformation to smaller types of like misleading contexts. That way, we don't fall in the trap of just disinformation and misinformation. So we have 7 types of misleading information in general. They're on a spectrum. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Azza.
Of course.
Next, I would like to introduce Tamoa Khalzadia. She is an investigative journalist, and she's also the director of El Detector, which is Univision's fact-checking arm. Thank you so much.
Hi. I prepared some slides, but I understand that you have a lot of questions for me, and it's more interesting. I just want to talk about El Detector and what we are doing. El Detector is the first Spanish language fact-checking platform created in the US. We launched this website and this platform in 2016 and relaunched thanks WhatsApp grant in the middle of the campaign in 2020. The electoral campaign between Trump and Clinton. And we are certified by the International Fact-Checking Network. Is a network that certified more than 100 fact-checking platforms. In the US, we are more than 100, but just 2 in Spanish. We are focused on serving the Hispanic community by debunking mis and disinformation targeted at the Latino population. It's not just language, is identify what is the content that is targeted at Latino population. It's different. We are identifying patterns, in misinformation and disinformation in platforms, in social media. We are seeing conspiracy theories. In the last 2 years, about vaccines, about COVID-19, about fraud of the 2020 election. Is content that repeated again and again, and it becomes in ideas that are in groups of people that is very, very difficult to dismantle because it is it's like an ideology. We are seeing manipulated images in photos and videos, especially in the middle of the war in Ukraine, in the invasion of Russia. And we are seeing images out of context. They are authentic images, but they are from events, times, and places different to the situation they are being used for. And we're seeing manipulated videos with wrong subtitles in Spanish. Is and perfect examples that targeted Latino population. We have a perfect example. This case is President Biden saying something in English in a press conference with Spanish subtitles, purposely say something different than what he actually said. The subtitles say, "We are to attack Russia." And we was answer to a journalist with, "We are studying the intelligence of Russia, blah 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 blah." But in Spanish, said, "We are to attack Russia." And in social media, that messages said, "Start the third war." Is a perfect example that we have to debunk every time, every single day in El Detector. We have alliance, for example, with other fact-checking platform, with fact-check.org, for example, is a platform in English, and we are doing translation with some stories, but that is the kind of stories that in El Detector we need to do for our audience, because other platform in English is not doing because it's not their audience, no? And we have another example is in the last 2 years is happening right now. Is the issue between Chris Rock and Will Smith. And you were saying, you are talking about the intention, no? Is an example about the intention. That measure is about, here are the first words of Chris Rock about the episode in the Oscars. And when you read the first words, okay, I want to apologize with Jada Smith, and blah, 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 blah. And when you read the second paragraph, is propaganda or ads about politicals in Central America or Latin America or a gym or whatever. And the people copy and paste the first paragraph about alleged apologize of Chris Rock, and the second paragraph is what they want. The propaganda about president candidates in Latin America, AMLO, López Obrador, the president of Mexico, or Petro, the candidate of Colombia, or a gym in Central America, or whatever. And that's occurred in the last 48 hours.
I'm just curious because I haven't, and I could be missing it, but I haven't seen that type of disinformation in English yet. Is this, do you feel like this is something that right now is specific to Spanish language disinformation?
It's interesting because I didn't see in English. It's a perfect example that something that occurred in Spanish. It's targeted in Latino population, and it's interesting. We are focused in that kind of disinformation in Latino population, and we found in CrowdTangle is a tool that we are looking for every single day that kind of content, and we figure out that is viral in Latin America, but in the US too, but in Spanish. Interesting. What are we doing every day? We are doing our work, but we distribute in social media with creative formats because we are fighting with disinformation, with creative formats, colorful ratings, false, misleading, or no evidence, but with colors. Our ratings are, each rating are with color, no? And we are constant monitoring our audience in social media. Twitter, Facebook is our main source of monitoring, no? Direct distribution and engagement. No, we are in WhatsApp right now. We launched yesterday our tip line in WhatsApp in Spanish, and we are monitoring constantly in WhatsApp. We had a beta WhatsApp for 2 months, but officially we launched yesterday. And we are waiting a lot of content in WhatsApp because for Latino population in Latin America, but here WhatsApp is a source of disinformation, but it's a kind of communication for our families or for us too. No? And it is our tip line is our number, and we have videos, animations, illustration is the kind that we have. We figure out that the people connect with us. It's a fight. It's a fight. In social media, for us, with the disinformation, is a battle constantly. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Tamoa, whether about fact-checking more broadly or specific to Spanish language?
Lenny Sue Paul with WPTV. I was wondering how you use the information you find. How do you broadcast that? What do you all do to put it on air? Do you have like a section in your newscast where you're debunking this, or is it just woven through? How do you relate it to the broadcast side?
On television or something like that? Yes, we have integration with TV. We have oh my God, streaming. We have shows in streaming in the morning and at night. And we have, for example, QR code to link directly, for example, right now to the tip line. And we present our note, for example, images that we debunking about the misleading images about the Ukraine war. And we present in 1 minute and 1:30 minutes in TV on streaming. Okay, that image is false because blah 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 blah, and you can see watch more in our website. It's 1 minute and a half in television, QR code, and the people can watch more in our platform, in our website. It's really important for us.
Jason Delgado, Florida Politics. Is Spanish talk radio in South Florida still problematic with disinformation? And I'm wondering if it's getting any more intense with midterm elections coming up.
Feel free to go on up there.
What is your question specifically?
Is it getting worse? And then is there anything that you're doing to address the Spanish talk radio? Or otherwise, what options are there?
I don't have specifically an answer for that. We are doing our work, but the radio is problematic for us too. We receive a lot of questions about that. We are debunking disinformation that is spread about the radio in Spanish. We know, for example, a group of people that are listening that shows in the radio in Spanish, and right now they are watching El Detector, and they are calling the shows on the radio, and I'm reading in El Detector that is false. But I don't know what's going on with the monitoring with that problem. I don't have a program specifically for that, but it's necessary.
Uriel Garcia with the Texas Tribune. My question is, I've seen a lot of mis or disinformation campaigns, and as I'm coming to learn, mostly in Florida. But I wanted to ask you, why is Florida becoming a targeted place for disinformation as opposed to, for Spanish language disinformation, I should say, as opposed to California, Arizona,
I have a study. Look at this. I don't know, the Hispanics is really vulnerable. But I have a lot of studies, but look at this. Look at this. According to a study, Nielsen is a firm specializing in audience research. U.S. Hispanics are the population group that expresses the greatest interest in staying informed and at the same time wanting that information to be verified. The same study reveals that 98% of Hispanic adults, more than any other group, have at least one smartphone. But they spend an average of 30 hours a week connected to the internet, 2 hours more than the rest of the population groups, and are 57% more likely than the rest of the U.S. population to believe as reliable the information they find on social media, even if the sources are not trustworthy. And according to the other organization, AVAAZ, while Facebook has the capacity to identify and stop the viralization of 70% of false messages produced in English, this prevention decreases to 30% when it comes to the Spanish language. You have a lot of people in Spanish vulnerable with a smartphone. A lot of people consume information. You have less regulation or less flag or less attention, no? You have a lot of people more vulnerable, and you have people with career with language, no? With, I don't know, there are a lot of reasons to do more vulnerable, no?
Okay, thank you both so much.